Presies 2 jaar gelede het president Ramaphosa ons eerste harde grendelstaat aangekondig. Lockdowns is reg deur die wêreld ingestel deur regerings in 'n poging om die COVID-pandemie te beheer. Die grendelstate word beskryf as die grootste regeringsingryping in die lewens van burgers sedert die Tweede Wêreldoorlog. Was die ingryping suksesvol? Is daar konkrete data wat die vraag beantwoord? Hier oorkant my sit die arbeids- en regskenner Frans Rautenbach, ook Dr. Angelique Coetzee wat op die adviesraad van Solidariteit se doktersgilde dien en op Zoom sluit Dr. Aslam Dasoo van die Progressiewe Gesondheidsforum by ons aan. Dr. Dasoo, so if one does research about this topic, you get one study that says lockdown saved millions of lives and another study saying it saved almost none. Are we living in a world now where everyone has their own scientist and their own answer?
Good evening, and good evening to my fellow panelists. Let me begin just by giving you an historical insight here. In the 10th century, a Persian polymath called Ibn Sina, physician, philosopher, mathematician, figured out before they knew about the germ theory of disease, that in epidemics, if you separated the sick from the well, you would bring an end to the epidemic, and he chose a 40-day period of separation. 500 years later, the Italians, the Florentians, discovered his writings, and they followed the same path because they had outbreaks of the Black Plague. And they termed the separation, the sequestration of people, quarantine, 40 days. Now, I say this little story to indicate that pandemics are well known. They've come throughout history. We knew the effects of pandemics. We've experienced them here. We've had the HIV pandemic. And when COVID arrived on our shores, the government, like governments everywhere, was so uncertain, so panic-stricken, that it acted with blunt force and initiated a lockdown. And one can understand it in the light of the instantaneous transfer of information. We were seeing what was happening in Europe already, and they took the decision. Much to our consternation, they took the decision to shut down the country completely for 3 weeks and gave the country 4 days to get ready for it, when the majority of people would not be able to secure enough resources to sustain them for 3 weeks. But they did it anyway. And they added insult to injury when they realized that actually this enormous power that the Disaster Management Act gave them was such that they could avoid any parliamentary oversight, they could avoid scrutiny, they could avoid any question about why they were doing it. And they extended it for 3 months and caused such severe damage to the social fabric of the country, to the economic fabric of the country, that we will take years to recover from. That is now history. And one can even perhaps excuse that overzealous act, but it caused a lot of harm. What it did not do was stop the number of infections. We got them all anyway, even though we might have delayed them for a bit. And so the entire wisdom behind lockdowns was suspect from the start. Now, of course, governments have to take action when the populace is at risk and when infections are surging and you need to separate people, you need to quarantine those who are sick, and all of those measures were put into place. What they didn't do, as they promised to do in those 3 months, was fix the health system, make it ready for what was going to be inevitable. So when the inevitable came, the health system was about as ready as before the pandemic. And so we experienced great trauma. So let me stop there for a moment, okay. And I'm sure your other guests would like to weigh in on this.
Frans, jy het navorsing oor hierdie kwessie gedoen verlede jaar. Wat het jy gevind?
Ja, ek het sommer net vir die kwaad geld, het ek gaan kyk, wat is die 6 lande in die wêreld wat die minste inperking gehad het. Dis daar is syfers, daar's 'n indeks wat mens kan kyk na, wat deur Our World in Data opgestel word. En die lande, as ek nou almal kan onthou, is Taiwan, Japan, Macau, en dan 2 lande in Afrika, Burundi en Tanzanië en Belarus. En ek het gaan kyk na die tydperk tot en met ek dink die einde van Junie van verlede jaar. Sedert die begin, soos min of meer die piek van die eerste golf, soos hulle dit genoem het. En ek was absoluut verstom om te sien dat die gemiddelde sterftesyfer in daai lande was van die heel laagstes. 15 per miljoen, terwyl die wêreldgemiddelde op daai stadium 123 was. En ek praat nie eens van lande soos België en so en wat hier na die 1000se kant toe gegaan het nie. So, dis een van die goed wat my van die begin af heeltemal nuuskierig gehad het, en ek het tot die gevolgtrekking gekom, nie alleen dat dit nie help nie, om een of ander rede, en ons kan praat oor hoekom, maak dit die probleem erger. Dit is wat die statistiek vir my gesê het.
Angelique, in jou ervaring, het dit die probleem erger gemaak, soos wat Frans sê?
Dis 'n baie moeilike vraag, of hierdie lockdowns werklik op die ou einde enigstens lewens gered het. Ons kan nou almal sit en terugkyk, want ons het die ervaring daarvan. En dit gaan oor balans. Ons moes 'n balans gevind het reg van die begin af, tussen wat in die ekonomie gebeur en in gesondheidsorg. Ons het nie daai balans gevind nie. Ons het die hele ekonomie gaan opduiwel, veral met 'n vlak 5 grendelstate, en sommige van daai besluite wat daar geneem is, grens net aan dom onnoselheid. Daar is geen ander woord om van dit te sê nie. So, maar ons het weer eens nie mooi geleer nie. En vandag sit ons in 'n vlak 1, wat eintlik niks beteken nie. Dit is so goed soos ons is nie meer in een nie. Vir die regering, want gisteraand is daar weer aangekondig dat ons hoef nie meer ons maskers te dra buite in die openbaar nie. En goed, ek het glad nie 'n probleem daarmee nie. Maar nou, en dan die 1 meter. So as jy na 1 meter toe skuif, kan jy maar net so al uit 'n mediese oogpunt uit dit los. Dit beteken niks nie. En ons weet dat die skole al laas jaar begin dringe daarop aandring, dat dit 1 meter nie 1.5 nie, want hulle het nie genoeg klaskamers vir almal nie. So weet jy, ons het daar onder politieke druk gesoog. Wat vir my baie ontstellend is, en met hierdie lockdowns wat ons gehad het, is soos wat Dr. Aslam gesê het, ons het nie gaan voorberei in ons mediese fasiliteite regtig in plek gebring nie. Wat het die regering tot en met vandag gedoen aan sanitasie? Onthou, dit werk op 4, ons het altyd gesê daar's 4 beginsels. Die beginsel van masker dra, sosiale afstande, sanitasie en ventilasie. So, gisterand is daar nou vir die burgers oorgegee, dat ons is nou die verantwoordelikheid met die maskers en die 1 meter, as ook die vaksine wat ons moet sorg dat ons kry. Maar wat het die regering gedoen om seker te maak dat daar sanitasie is in skole? Wat het hulle gedoen om seker te maak daar is ventilasie? So alles word oorgeskuif na die burgers. Dis presies wat gebeur het met hierdie grendelstate ook. Jy weet, alles is net gesluit, maar wat het die regering gedoen? Wat het hulle gedoen om hierdie goed te verbeter? Jy weet, mense is inperkingsfoos op hierdie stadium. As jy vir 'n pasiënt sê, dra jou masker, kan ek sommer sien, dokter, jy's nie ernstig nie. Hulle is so, in die Afrikaanse woord, gatvol daarvoor om dit te dra. En ek kan hulle nie kwaadlik neem nie, maar is omdat die boodskappe nie reg uitgekom het nie. Jy weet jy, ons is nog ver vanuit die moeilikheid uit, om nog 1300 gevalle per dag te hê. Ons het nog nie 1 week gehad waar daar geen gevalle was nie. So hierdie inperking ons regtig gehelp. Dit gaan oor ander goed wat ons moet na kyk. So vir my, baie moeilik, ons moet beweeg na normaliteit, ons het nie 'n keuse nie.
Dr. Dasoo, if we look at the South African context, is it a question of lockdowns that might work in certain European countries, but not here?
No, I don't think so. You see, here's the problem. Politicians generally have a very poor facility with biology. The way this virus moves, the way it transmits, the kind of illness it causes, are very well known. We knew even at the outset that it's a respiratory virus. We first thought it only spread through droplets. And then we understood that actually it's aerosol spread. And it behaves very much like other respiratory viruses. So we have this knowledge. When I helped to convene the science reference group, comprising of some of our most eminent scientists, some of whom called the government out. They were all sitting on the Ministerial Advisory Committee. They called the government out for its nonsensical regulations, certainly in the early days, and paid the price for that. Nevertheless, we convened under the Progressive Health Forum. And what we clearly tracked was the way this virus moved, the way the pandemic unfolded, and how out of sync the regulatory remit that this whole lockdown arrangement was with it. Now, let's accept that we have gone through this, and as Angelique says, we have 2020 vision in retrospect. And when they established this NCCC, this command council, that's when the red light started flashing for me. Because it's a completely opaque, unaccountable, unelected structure without any constitutional parliamentary oversight of it. And when you leave politicians with such unfettered power, they can do all sorts of things. So a ministerial advisory committee advisory would come, well thought through, proper science, giving its guidelines and saying this is what we should do. It gets into that mincemeat machine. It gets layered with other dubious agendas. And we have now suffered the consequences of that. So when they come out and say we are following the science, they convince the president of that. And the president then, who has to trust in his institutions, duly reads it out. When we spoke to the president separately, he took a different line on one of the occasions. And I think that just indicated to me that we are on a two-speed or a two-tier government at this time during the pandemic. And that always results in negative consequences, as we have seen. But we have arrived at a two-year point. We have arrived at an inflection point in the pandemic. This recent wave we've had has indicated that we are now, we have sufficient population immunity at terrible cost because our vaccination rates were low, and that people who got naturally infected, they form the majority of severe illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. But the fact is that over 80% of the population now has immunity. And how we move forward, as Dr. Coetzee was saying, has to be on a more logical basis. In fact, today, our top scientists just published what we should be doing, and that is getting rid of this state of disaster in its entirety. Putting regulations under the National Health Act may be an attempt to say, okay, this is a public health emergency and we deal with it as a public health matter through the health legislation. However, the draft regulations they've put out, pretty much say the same thing that the Command Council was saying. So I don't think it takes us very far. I think we need to drop all of those. I think we need to stop making COVID a notifiable illness. And I think we need to start a surveillance process where we can track this bug very well, go through the upcoming waves, which won't be as bad as what we have experienced, and know that we have sufficient authority in the law and in the cabinet and in the presidency to deal with any exigencies that may arise.
Frans, maar ons weet ook dat die inperking 'n reuse ekonomiese uitwerking ook gehad het en dit kan nie net in rand en sent gemeet word nie.
Weet jy wat my verskriklik frustreer is die idee dat jy het gesondheid en jy het ekonomie. Dit is nie twee verskillende probleme nie, dit is dieselfde probleem. Albei het te doen met menslike welvaart. Die een is maar net 'n ander aanvraag wat die mark het, en dis die vraag na gesondheid. Net soos jy vraag na kos het, of vraag na water, of na klere, of na vervoer. En ek gebruik 3 woorde, dis 'n ekonomiese probleem, dis kompleksiteit, kompromis en kompetisie. Kom ek verduidelik gou-gou. Kompleksiteit is soos 'n ekonomiese mark. Dis te ingewikkeld om uit 'n sentrale stoel te regeer. Dis onmoontlik. Net so met 'n pandemie. Daar is, en dis waar die kompromis inkom, almal moet afwegings maak van waardes. Jy verhandel risiko's. As iemand in 'n myn werk, dan verruil hy die risiko van doodgaan van die honger vir die risiko van 'n rotsstorting. Dis 'n afweging van risiko's. Die hele wêreld werk so. En ma's met kinders doen dit al vir millennia. Hulle ruil die risiko vir skool toe gaan met die risiko vir sterf van die honger. So ons moet daai continuum van ekonomiese probleme, dis eintlik waaroor dit gaan. En die berekenings is dis 30 keer gevaarliker in terme van sterftes en armoede om hierdie grendelstate te hê as wat die pandemie ooit sou gedoen het.
Dis 'n enorme onderwerp, maar dis ongelukkig alwaarvoor ons tyd het. Baie dankie. COVID is weer 'n enorme probleem vir die Chinese regering. Kan hulle zero COVID beleid nou uiteindelik in duie stort? Bly ingeskakel.